Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and a very big welcome to Creative Islands, the Isles of Scilly. This is another one of our EDGE series, which is being run by the research clusters Silk and Hark, the University of the Highlands and Islands. So today we have a panel discussion, and I will introduce the members, the speakers that we have today. We have Tammy Bedford, who is the Creative Islands coordinator. Tammy is a freelance arts producer with over 30 years experience in arts management and commissioning. She's now based in Cornwall. She's worked at a senior local authority level, running cultural services, which include public art projects and live arts programming, arts education initiatives. For the past 10 years, she's led on projects in a range of art forms, including an annual visual art program for the WOMAD Festival and music commissions with contemporary composers and sound artists. We also have Jeremy Brown, who is Creative Islands coordinator. Jeremy is a freelance arts professional with a long career in arts management and education. He's currently based on the Isle of Scilly, and he spent much of his career in the Western Midlands. He's worked at a senior level on creative partnership initiatives and also an advisor for creative people and places, working alongside community groups to increase access to cultural activity. He's worked as a visiting lecturer in drama and media at the University of Wolverhampton and for the City Council events team in Wolverhampton to support an annual events programme. We are also welcoming today Toby Carr, senior lecturer at Falmouth University. Toby is an architect with over 10 years experience. His interests are related to community engagement in the creative process, ecological design, and responsible making to improve the quality of our built environment. In 2018, searching for a new challenge and adventure beyond his desk, he embarked on a journey to sea kayak in all the areas of the UK shipping forecast, linking stories, places, and histories of our local settlements and closest neighbours. Toby is facilitating a collaboration between Falmouth University BA Hons, Architecture and Creative Islands to explore ideas for a centre for life on Scilly. We are also welcoming Piers Lewin, who is a chef, a dry stone waller, a musician, and a writer. Piers has lived with his family on St Agnes, Isle of Scilly, since 1997. He's embraced the historical Scillian tradition of creative multitasking. He's come to love working with the produce of the island, whether in the form of food from the land and the sea, driftwood from the beach, granite from beneath the ground, music from the pristine soundscape, or stories from the community's collective consciousness. Piers has produced 10 albums of original music inspired by St Agnes, a recipe book, collection of poetry, and a large number of structures in granite and wood. And I have to say, it sounds like a person from the Gaeltacht with all that creative multitasking. While Menmuir, novelist, editor, and literary consultant, is also joining us. While's first novel, The Many, was nominated for the Man Booker Prize and was an Observer Best Fiction of the Year. His second novel, Foxfires, is released in March 2020 with Salt Publishing. While's short fiction has appeared in Best British Short Stories, Elementum Journal, Pipeline, and has also been published by Nightjar Press and National Trust. He's written for Radio 4's The Guardian and The Observer, and he is a regular contributor to the journal Elementum. Weil was a contributor to the Creative Islands Walking Stories project. So that is a rather marvellous lineup we have today, and I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Tammy. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone. Before we get started, I should just explain that Piers Lewin isn't actually with us today, but you will be hearing some of his work later on in the presentation. So I think we should probably start by telling you where we are. And we're really at the opposite end of the country to our host today. So here's the UK, and here's where the Isles of Scilly are. It's actually an archipelago of 5 inhabited islands and about 140 uninhabited islands and islets, situated 28 miles off the coast of Cornwall. These are the 5 inhabited islands, the largest of which is St Mary's. There's a total population of 2,300 or thereabouts, most of which are on St Mary's. So, you know, a really small community. That very small island down at the bottom, St Agnes, is actually the most southerly point in England, that drops below the Lizard. And this is what it looks like. And it really is this beautiful. These aren't glossy holiday brochure photos. They're actually images that I've taken over the many years of visiting, and it is a stunningly beautiful place. But it can also look like this. This is the Scilonian, which is the only passenger ferry, also known as the Vomit Comet at times. It's a 2.5-hour trip from Penzance to get to the Isles of Scilly, and it doesn't run in the winter. So the only other way of getting to Scilly is either by helicopter or by very small plane. Tourism accounts for 85% of the economy on Scilly. So alongside the 2,000 plus residents, Scilly gets visitors of around 100,000 a year, possibly more than that, but within a very short season. And that's where Creative Islands comes in. In 2017, Islands Partnership, which is the destination management organisation for Scilly, the tourist board, if you like, IP successfully bid for funding through the Arts Council Cultural Destinations programme. And this was a national scheme launched by Arts Council that aimed at making links between culture and tourism. So it's really looking at how the arts and culture could grow the visitor economy, and a really crucial thing for Scilly with the reliance on tourism. So there was 2 years funding available, and that's where Jeremy and I came in. We were appointed as a job share, and I should say that Jeremy is based on Scilly. I'm based on mainland Cornwall, so I flit over when I can. And that's when Creative Islands was born. We realised 2 things very quickly. Firstly, that 2 years is no time at all to really make a difference in terms of growing visitors and having a real impact on the creative sector on Scilly. And that although, as far as the Arts Council was concerned, cultural destinations was visitor focused, we felt that we had to work with residents in order to build anything sustainable. And that means resident artists, of which there are quite a big number, and the local community whose access to culture is necessarily limited by geography. And Jeremy will speak a bit more about that. So we felt that our best approach, given this very short timescale and not a lot of funding, was to embark on a pilot project, to see the 2 years as as a way of testing out what might work and what wouldn't work. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to invite artists to make creative contributions to the calendar of events that was already happening on Scilly. And Walk Scilly was one such event, a very popular walking festival, and we invited a number of artists, including Tony Plant, who did this beautiful sand drawing, which was a temporary work. It disappeared as soon as the tide came in, but it was very spectacular while it was there. We also wanted to raise the profile of Scilly-based creative practitioners and to support their work. And so we produced a very high quality publication which lists all of the artists and studios and galleries and is available free of charge to anyone who wants it. And that has proved very popular. We ran a programme of live events, bringing over artists from the mainland so that people on Scilly, whether they were visitors or residents, could experience high quality live arts. And that was part of a festival that we ran, which was supposed to be a regular thing, but COVID got in the way of that. But we're hoping that we'll be able to continue that. And we also set up a series of artist residencies where we wanted to invite artists of all kinds to respond to the things that make Scilly special, one of which is the dark skies. So we, through a selective process, we engaged artist Luke Jerram, whose work you may know, to come and do a residency on Scilly with the Community Observatory Group. And he's still involved with that, and we're still hoping that we'll be able to progress a proposal that he's come up with for a public artwork. So after 2 years of running cultural destinations, we took stock and talked to our partners, our mainland partners and our Scilly partners, and put together what we've called the Manifesto for Culture, which is a cultural strategy. But it's really articulating our plans and ambitions for the next 3 to 5 years. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy, who will tell you more about what those are.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Lindsay. So I'm Jeremy. I moved to Scilly 4 years ago, not anticipating getting a job in the arts, having a complete break from life in the West Midlands. But within a week or so, the opportunity to work with Tammy and work with cultural destinations came up. I think being on the island brought with it significant challenges. We reckon there are around 50 creatives who live and work on Scilly and make a living of sorts, predominantly through the visitor season by opening their galleries and studios. A lot of them are fiercely independent, ingenious, working in all sorts of different art forms. A lot of visual artists, some sculptors, potters, a couple of writers, musicians. When they heard there was Arts Council money coming to Scilly, their first reaction was, we should have it. Will you pay the rent? Will you give us a grant? So I think Tammy and I had to convince them that we weren't in a position to do that, but we were there to try and add value to their contribution to the visitor economy. So we spent a lot of time getting to know people and inherited this calendar of events: Walk Scilly, Taste of Scilly, Art Scilly, and a number of sporting events to do with rowing, gig rowing, and swim running. We realised that Scilly has very limited capacity for visitors. Through the summer, there is a loyal, returning crowd of people, and there are about 4,000 bed spaces, which certainly through the summer holidays are very full. So the challenge was to build the shoulder seasons. We were looking particularly at sort of April, May, and then September, October. to try and bring in some additional activity and try and develop opportunities for cultural tourism. Two of the things I did to try and befriend and get to understand the local community that I think were significant. One was joining the local theatre club and being drafted in to play the dame in the community pantomime. The other was becoming a school governor. There's one school on Scilly with 200 students. And again, both of those gave me a very fast in to working with families, working with young people, working with teachers, and getting to understand a lot more about the challenges those communities face, particularly around access to arts and culture, which for young people is a huge, huge challenge. I also operate a self-catering property with my partner. So this morning I've been doing a changeover day and just had time to get changed myself. Art Scilly in May had been created by a number of very imaginative local artists who tended to run small-scale workshops and events, often outdoors, often with perhaps half a dozen or 10 people taking part in participatory workshops stimulated by the islands, by the environment, often using found or salvaged materials. Hugely popular, and again, a significant following. So the first year we sort of observed and listened and then grew that, as Tammy has said, into Creative Scilly, a 2-week event, which we were able to hold in 2019 with around 70 events. We curated quite sensitively, quite carefully, the types of artists we added into the mix. If we brought mainland performers or mainland artists over, we were careful not to duplicate what was already on the islands. And we also tried to find material and topics that related to Solonian or Celtic culture. So we chose stuff that we thought would appeal to both residents and to visitors, and have built up a network of writers and performers, particularly, who like coming to work with us. The profile of visitors on Scilly traditionally is an aging type of regular, loyal visitor. We describe them as the empty nester, national truster, mountain warehouse, hip replacement. But we have seen a shift in the last 2 years, particularly with staycations, towards a slightly younger profile of visitor. Scilly tends to offer a week-long B&B or self-catering package, a bit resistant to short breaks because it requires more laundry. And on the whole, most of the property is managed through the destination management organisation. So there are fewer opportunities for people to book stuff independently. So we have a loyal following, and a lot of people love coming back. But one of our challenges is to try and identify new visitors who may have a particular interest in culture and heritage. And we're really fascinated to sort of share best practice. Talking to Joanna about ancestral tourism is one I'm really intrigued about. We have a huge history of maritime migration, and Scilly's economy sort of grew through shipbuilding into flower farming, and morphed then into tourism. So there is this whole ingenuity and survival ethic that's associated with living on islands. The biggest challenge we face is a lack of capacity, a lack of venue. A number of the church halls, a number of the public buildings on Scilly have fallen into disrepair. The elements batter everything over here. And the council have struggled to maintain a rather lovely town hall, which is no longer accessible. Likewise, the one museum that was our partner sort of organisation was actually closed 2 years ago, unfortunately, again, due to structural issues with the building that has now been consigned for demolition. We are now working very actively with a museum steering group to try and fundraise for a new museum on Scilly. and see that as an opportunity to include or incorporate a small-scale venue, a theatre or auditorium of some size and shape that would allow us to host events both for visitors and for the local community. So we're working on that with some very helpful consultants we've appointed from the mainland. We were able historically to run a young curators project, and in fact the museum is currently relocating itself, reinventing itself through a series of pop-ups, museum on the move, and they're going to be 10 or 12 small-scale exhibitions using some of the most sort of prized artifacts from their collection, and those are being shared for visitors at the same time as running a campaign to try and promote fundraising and awareness of our plans for a new build. Last year was disappointing. We cancelled around 60 events, but as Tammy has said, we're trying hard to sort of maintain those working relationships, and the manifesto has helped us do that. In her introduction, Lindsay mentioned my background in partnership working, and I think that has been hugely significant in coming to Scilly. We live in a tiny community that is very remote, so we've been really fortunate in befriending some mainland organisations. We work closely with Carn to Cove, who are the rural touring organisation for Cornwall and Devon, and have been very helpful in identifying performers to come over here. We're also working with Cultivator, who provide a lot of business support for creative industries, and we've been able to match them up with a number of our artists over here. And Cornwall Museum's partnership, again, have been tremendously useful. We're increasingly working closely with the Arts Council as well, and in fact hosting a visit from Darren Henley in September, which will be a first for him and for us in bringing the CEO of the Arts Council to Scilly to assess what we're up to and hopefully look to making some further investment. Possibly the most significant partners we've found have been the universities based in the southwest. We've worked with Falmouth, and Toby will tell you more about that, which is a fantastic collaboration. We've worked closely with Exeter University, who have a campus in Penryn in Cornwall, with a field trip of geographers who've been working with us, particularly on the visitor economy and doing research. And we've also worked with Plymouth University, who provided a consultancy for us. Just turn my phone off, sorry. I'll hand over now to Toby, because he can give us more information about the collaboration with Falmouth, which was hugely exciting for us and really kick-started a lot of the thinking that is now going into our new museum plans.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you to UHI for the invite to join the seminar today. It's great for me kind of personally to be kind of both here in Cornwall on Scilly and kind of in the Western Highlands and Islands, so very exciting. I'm going to talk today a bit about kind of the role of an academic institution working with community partners, and specifically how we made that work with this project, and I think what we got out of it. As Jeremy said, it was a fantastic collaboration, and for us it was a brilliant opportunity to basically take a brief from a real client, a real situation, a real place, and to translate that into a student brief that the students could respond to and develop their own projects which addressed some of the issues of the brief. So we run 2 programs at Falmouth University in the architecture department, the BA course and a master's course. We have around 85 students overall, and in the year group that I'm going to be talking about, we probably had around 25 students. So why would it be interesting for us to work on Scilly, apart from this amazing image that you can see on the screen at the moment? it is a really special place for lots of reasons that you've already heard about. From our point of view as a course, we place sustainable design, environmental design, and ecological design at the centre of what we're doing. We kind of we look at ways of sort of building differently, lessening our impact, reducing energy usage, and also kind of respecting the natural world. And so for us, Scilly kind of represented almost a bit of a test bed. So challenges to do with sustainable design, challenges to do with actually just physically building there, challenges to do with kind of exposure to the elements, challenges to do with scarcity, either of materials or funding or resources. And then also the really brilliant things that we've already heard about, kind of connectivity, supportive and resilient communities, and finding ways that we could kind of work together in that setting. So as Jeremy said, the sort of key to that really is sort of around collaboration. So next slide, please, Tammy. So I'll just give a quick overview of what our kind of take on this project was. So we, as a course, the use of what we call live projects is also fundamental to what we do, the way that we teach. So as part of our practice, we often are working with real clients, real communities, real partners, where the students get a kind of actual face-to-face, hopefully face-to-face experience, a live experience of working with real people in a real setting. So that's really important for us. And in terms of the role that we can play as an institution, obviously we can bring expertise from our practice kind of into the conversation. I think in this context, I would say that our role was really about trying to just question and reflect on the brief and aspirations of what Jeremy and Tammy were sort of starting out to achieve. And so from those kind of students in our group, they'll each design their own individual response to the brief. So lots of creative thought, lots of creative output, and opportunities to discuss that all along the way. So for us, that involved kind of some presentations. So here in the image, you can see Tammy over with our students in Cornwall as part of the briefing of the project. And we also had some remote sessions, some project reviews. This was planned before COVID hit, so we'd planned it with a sort of live presentation on Scilly with the students and a visit. Unfortunately, we had to cut that, but on reflection, one of the interesting things that came out of that was this idea of how can we work remotely in remote places, but paired with that really important kind of getting together at key points. So next slide, please, Tammy. So just a quick overview. It was a 12-week project which fitted one of our semesters. One of the challenges for us always is trying to mix or kind of merge a client timescale with our kind of academic timescale. And really here, I won't go into the detail of this, but I just wanted to pick up on something that Tammy said earlier. The initial discussions of our collaboration together on this project started way back in April 2019, and the students then sort of developed and handed in their work kind of at the end of July 2020, and then there's some subsequent reporting after that. So the idea that these kind of things need enough time to kind of take place, really important. Next slide, please, Tammy. This is a bit of a dry slide, but I just put it in because to reiterate that point about it really goes back to what we can do as an academic institution and how we align it with what we might need to achieve with our students and what a client's objectives might be. So this was looking at what we would be doing as teaching staff, what the Islands Partnership team would be doing, and what the students would be doing at the same time. So trying to align some of those key outputs. Next slide, please, Tammy. So one of the key things that came out of this, the students all produced their own project reports and portfolios, which are full of models, drawings, sketches, and ideas about how you could respond to this specific problem. And that was put together in a document which we have printed and made available online to share with as many people as possible, really, to try to sort of allow that work to get out there. Next slide, please, Tammy. So these are some really quick examples of what's in this document. We had a remote video briefing which had interviews with some of the key partners in the project from the planning team and also with Jeremy and Tammy and with the director of the museum. A couple of interesting workshops that we ran as part of this with the students were one which was looking at 5 key challenges of working here, and I think interestingly from an architectural course, lots of people might think that we're kind of obsessed with design and aesthetics all the time. All of the responses that came back from the students in the 5 key challenges were sort of site logistics and transport, supporting the local economy, sustainability and ecology, defining who the target market was, and then functionality and use. So they're all quite practical kind of things that the students were looking at and embedded in a sort of social understanding of the place. The other workshop, or another workshop that we ran, was looking at the islands in context, where we worked with some research done by the Ordnance Survey in the University of Sheffield, looking at the at similar sized islands, basically. So we looked at similar size in terms of geographical stats, and we looked at population. Interestingly, that kind of brought in the Isle of Mull, Isle of Islay, North and South Uist, and also Mersey Island and Alderney. And we were really looking at kind of what different islands had done, or what facilities people had in those places, start to inform the student work. Next, please, Tammy. So this is a quick one, just giving you an idea of sort of some of the outputs, some sketches, models, some CAD models, 3D sketches, lots of site analysis. Next, please, Tammy. And some examples of what the students did. So there's 25 different building proposals which came out of this project, which I think was a brilliant way of just sort of trying to unpack that brief a bit more and kind of working on some of the challenges. Next, please, Tammy. So some more examples of some of those outputs you can see, all very different and exploratory. Next, please. This is the last slide. So I just wanted to say, I guess, with this slide in summary, just to reiterate the kind of importance of collaboration here. So I think for us, we got out of this a brilliant brief in a unique place, lots of challenges for the students to address, real challenges, and things that they can take forwards kind of into architectural projects they'll be looking at in the future. And I think for Jeremy and Tammy, without wanting to kind of put too many words into their mouths, I think actually I've got a quote here from you both. There's a phenomenal amount of very creative work exhibited, and it gives us a tremendous helping of food for thought. So I hope that we helped to kind of add to that briefing process, and there was sort of mutual benefit from both sides. that's it for me. So there's a link at the bottom there to this document, and I'm just going to pop it in the chat as well. So I will hand over to Will.
Fantastic, thanks, Toby. And thank you for having me here as well. What I'm going to be talking about is a project that I was involved with that was commissioned by Creative Islands. This was Walking Stories, and the idea behind Walking Stories was a small anthology with one fictional story for each of the inhabited islands of Scilly. So the stories commissioned were by Piers Lewin, who I believe it came up with the idea originally, and lives on St Agnes and has that real connection with the place that he lives. There was an image of Piers in Tammy's slides, I think, or Jeremy's, with him sitting on the at the edge of the sea with some sort of wind instrument. I'm not technical enough to know what that is. Recording, and so he's making music, writing, and really being embedded in that place. Sam Llewellyn, Mariam Molteno, and Michael Morpurgo, who wrote about Briar, with his long-standing relationship with that island. And I was asked to write about St Martin's. Now, I don't live on Scilly. I live in Cornwall, like Toby and Tammy. I do have a relationship with the islands, although it doesn't go back as far as lots of the other contributors. So it might be worth just briefly telling you where that relationship comes from. That started with a feature I was asked to write for The Guardian for their travel section on a family holiday to Scilly, and in the way of these things, I met Jeremy on Tresco. Jeremy had been asked to show me around the gardens at Tresco, and we got talking about my work, not as a journalist, but as a writer of fiction, as a novelist, short story writer, and Jeremy invited me back, and I think the project really came about in quite an organic way. It was through discussion and through trying to find a decent fit. Now, I didn't really know St Martin's when I was asked to write this story. So as part of the project, I asked for a short residency on St Martin's at the end of November in 2018, and spent just shy of a week on St Martin's in a small B&B. I think there was a late summer that year, and spent most of the time walking around in shorts and t-shirts. It was glorious. And when I arrived, I had in my head this idea of a story that I was going to tell, that I'd been thinking about on the way over, and I'd pretty much worked out what that story was as I stepped off the boat onto the island. And one of the things that happened pretty quickly is I realized that story wasn't really going to work, because I come up with that story before I'd even arrived. I come up with it with this idea of a story that I'd imported almost, and I changed my approach quite drastically as a result of that, and decided instead to totally ditch the idea of the story I came with, which incidentally was, I think it was based on a sort of collection of ghosts of shipwrecked sailors from over the centuries, and I'd done a bit of research into the different shipwrecks, and I got these voices in my head, and I got the characters, and I thought it was going to be a pretty decent story, but I realised that actually that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. Now, Tammy, I'm not going to do my best Chris Whitty here and ask you for the next slide, please, but would you be able to give me about 25 to 30 seconds on each of the next few slides, just to keep me going quickly, because what I want to do is leave some time at the end to actually play you some of the stories. So the stories were designed to be walking stories. They're designed to be listened to rather than read, although there is a physical anthology as well. So my first practice was walking. Walking round the edge of this island, walking on the, I mean, this here is Little Bay, heading towards Great Bay, I think. How memories fade very quickly of names and places, but that was it was following the paths round, and very quickly I worked out that the map I'd been given, the tourist map, gave me a certain way around this island that it wanted me to take. However, within the B&B where I was staying, there were a load of older maps, and I got really interested in looking back at what these older maps had that the tourist map I had been given didn't. And I started going back through layers of different maps and finding out different little different details that I couldn't get off the map that I'd been given. Lots to do with the naming of things, the naming of different rocks, the naming of different caves. There's a brilliant cave on Whit Island called Underland Girt, which just is probably the best named cave I've ever come across. It didn't make it into the story, but started thinking about how the naming of things is going to affect the story that I wanted to write. But it also took me off track. It took me off track into to sort of scramble down some of the cliffs and found myself a little cave in which to write, which was a rather glorious thing. So this was my little writing spot for the week. As well as doing those walks, lots of what I was doing was talking to people that I came across. There weren't many visitors on the island at the end of November. In fact, I think I was one of the only visitors. I met two others while I was there, and they were people who had lived on the island previously. So lots of it was talking to people about their stories, listening, and that is probably the biggest part of my job, as actually more than writing is listening to people's stories. Listening, taking on board sort of the photographs that I could find, the ones that you can see here, the little rituals that this particular place had developed, the flower farming, the gig rowing, taking on board small details about what birds were going to be on the island at different times of year. This was a brilliant blackboard that's updated regularly by Viv Jackson, and I started to recognise, actually, yeah, if I'm going to be setting this particular story at different times of year, there's going to be different. There are going to be different birds, different things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of before. I realised I had to get lots of the details right. I had to. There's a very small number of families who live on the island, so going back and looking through the graveyard, looking at headstones, not for particular characters necessarily, but for the sort of the big families that I might bring into this story. Came across a lot of things that would have been easy to get wrong. Actually, on the next slide, there is one that I would have definitely got wrong, which are the top. Don't do left and right hand image is an image of a stone labyrinth, which looks ancient, and there are loads of these down on the shore opposite Whit Island, and I really probably would have had those down as ancient things until I was chatting with someone in the post office, I think, and they said, oh yeah, some school kids made those in the 1980s, and it was one of those. It started making me question what I was looking at and the responsibility that I had to tell this story correctly. Paying attention just to things that took my eye. Obviously, dead and decaying things were taking my eye here. There was a seal and a small rodent of some sort. I'm sure someone on here could tell us what it was, but that made it into the story. And through this process of walking, noticing, talking to people, I started building up an idea of a whole new story and a sort of an amalgam character who would tell fictionalized stories of this particular place. This was my last character. This is the double-faced Celtic idol, and I met the ex-fisherman who had concreted him in place here and had wonderful stories about it. He's incidentally he's called Billy Idol. It was a process of bringing all of these things together and trying to get a real sense of place through intense listening. And actually, I took that process home, and I managed to get some phone numbers of people for those follow-up questions, because I really, really wanted to get the details right. Wanted to make sure that that the story that I came out with felt like it could have only been written in this particular place. Now, when it was all written, when it was all edited, the idea behind the stories was to keep the process local. So we recorded the audio, and Ed Rowe, Kono King, and actor, voiced my particular story. We had music by Piers Lewin, whose idea the walking stories was. Illustration by Scilonian artists. So this illustration here is by Alex Bagnall, who did the illustrations for the anthology. And we had a local designer, Philida Blumel, and I believe it was printed very locally in Cornwall as well. Booths, I imagine. So all of that contributed to the look and feel and overall sense of place that comes into that's quite necessary, I think, for these stories. Now, I wanted we've got a 3-minute clip of the audio, which I believe that Tammy, if you could help us with that. So I just want to give you a sense of that story to finish with before we have questions. Thank you very much.
Images I did.
That's the end of our presentation. So I think we're happy for the Q&A bit.
Excellent. Thank you so much to our panel. That was just such a wonderful early afternoon experience. I picked up on a question here from Siún Carden, and it was something that indeed I was very interested in, which is a question about the, she was very interested in the role of the university with the community. And so she was asking, can you tell us a little bit more what it was like from the partners' side? She also added, we note that she was really interested in seeing the timescale table that you showed us. Toby, I wonder if there was anything that you could tell us about the partners' side that Siún is asking about?
I guess that's probably one for Jeremy and Tammy, really. I mean, our work fitted into kind of really just a small part of their ongoing process with the project around the new home for the museum. And so, yeah, I guess kind of, I'd just say from our point of view, it's about having that having that discussion earlier, making sure that we kind of had aligned our outputs and our sort of meetings and get-togethers and things with Jeremy and Tammy. But I don't know, Tammy, do you have something to add to that?
I think we were aware that we were giving the students quite a tricky brief. We were asking for a lot, but I think one of the reasons we went into this collaboration was because we were just really interested to see what creatively what would come out of it, and how a group of senior architecture students would respond to that brief and that particular place. As Toby said in his presentation, it was very unfortunate that COVID got in the way of the group being able to come over on their for their study visit, but given that most of them hadn't set foot on Scilly when they were doing this work, they did an extraordinary they were able to respond with a great deal of sensitivity and clearly did their research. So it was a really positive experience for us.
I think field trips for universities is something that we're really actively trying to promote. The idea of reducing carbon footprints and international travel is certainly something that the universities in the Southwest are taking very seriously. And Scilly can offer a tremendous range of stimulus, both from the environmental point of view, with rising sea levels, issues around energy use, and the whole question of the visitor economy, as well as the geography of the place. So we're really keen, and what that brings with it is, a bright young demographic who very often say, well, I'd love to come back here or bring my mum or whoever else. So it's a really positive way of reaching out to other people. And we've also made sure that if university undergraduates are here, they get the chance to work with the school, they get the chance to talk to local businesses, and there is a genuine sense of that collaboration and participation.
Thank you. Yes, can I ask just a little bit more? I'm really interested in this brief that the students were set, and you mentioned that or your colleague Tammy mentioned that it was quite tricky. I wonder if you could just elaborate on that a little bit. I'm just quite intrigued about that brief.
I mean, it was tricky from a practical sense, in that the site that we gave them, which is one of two sites that we are still considering for this new cultural centre, is basically a granite outcrop looking out to sea. So it posed all sorts of logistical, practical design issues for the students. also, the, you know, Scilly is extremely environmentally sensitive, and so, you know, the sort of visual aesthetic and design, you know, would have to be taken into account, not least because the site is owned by the Duchy of Cornwall and Prince Charles, who, as we all know, has a very clear view on architecture. So, you know, there was that to factor in. There's the logistics of designing something for an island that's in you know, in the middle of the Atlantic, and getting materials over. So, you know, and engaging with the local community. And I see there's a question in the chat about that very issue, which maybe we can come on to. But yeah, but they rose to the challenge, I think.
Fantastic. Yes, that's fantastic. Yes, the question that Raggy asks is, she's interested to hear more about the resident population who were involved and engaged, and how they reacted to the project. And she said she's thinking about residents who are not artists in themselves, maybe the indigenous or autochthonous members of the community. Maybe that's something that Raggy might be thinking about there.
In terms, Will, are you going to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, just very briefly, in terms of the Walking Stories project, that was it was something I became aware of very quickly, was the fact it had to be something that felt like it was from the island. So it depended on people's stories, and I was worried at the beginning about how open people would be with those stories. But what I found is, because lots of the people I was talking to were fairly elderly, they wanted to tell these stories. They wanted to tell the stories about what their lives growing up on the islands. And one of them said something to me which really, really struck home. He said it's important that you listen carefully, because I haven't told this story before, and you know, we've never written it down, and it might be, you know, we want you to pass that on. We want you to share that story further. So even though it was fictionalized, lots of the stories that go across, well, my story in particular, come from snippets of things that happened to people in their childhood or middle age, and it was just taking in those little experiences and sharing them further, and that gave me the confidence then to put those experiences on paper.
I think to answer Raggy's question, we managed Toby's project very tightly with our steering group, which is made up of the museum trustees, the Duchy and the council. And what that did was then inform the work that Tammy and I put into a manifesto that was very much driven by the community. So the consultation that went into the manifesto allowed us to get support from around 30% of the population have endorsed the manifesto, either as a business or as somebody who's actively involved in arts and culture, or indeed involved with organisations in the voluntary sector, the University of the Third Age, the WI, the local folk club. So we used Toby's work really to pave the way for some very imaginative thinking, and we'll be moving into a phase of very carefully managed community consultation once we have actually chosen one of the two sites that Tammy refers to. There's a huge resistance to change on Scilly. There's a lot of suspicion around what the council and what the Duchy are up to. They tend to counteract each other's plans. So work to develop the infrastructure here is very, very slow. And the challenges of building 30 miles out to sea, again, make it both expensive and complicated.
The other thing I'd add about the issue around the resident population and how they've been involved in Creative Islands as a whole is that on Scilly, and this may be the case in other island communities, that the artists are very integrated into the community, and as you heard in the description of Piers Lewin at the beginning and his biography, you know, he's an artist, and he's a chef, and he's a dry stone waller, and he's a woodworker. And, you know, we have artists on Scilly who are printmakers and scientists, and or glass artists, and run a local bed and breakfast. So there's this sort of multi-tasking thing that goes on, which means that there isn't a sort of separation, if you like, between the creative community and the rest of the community, which I think makes our job a lot easier.
Thank you, Tammy. Yes, there's so much actually that your community and us in the Gaeltacht and the Highlands and Islands can share. All those kind of discussions about places and naming and peeling back history and intense listening, and about exchanges with makers and creatives and academia and small communities and maritime communities. We've got so much to share, and it's been a huge pleasure to hear your panels talking about the project today. I'm extremely grateful that you have come here today, and unfortunately we've run out of time. It's 4 minutes past 2, but yeah, brilliant start to our summer, to hear your stories, and a pleasure to meet you all via VC. Thank you so much.